I remember the transfer not as a mercy, but as a reassignment. That was the word stamped onto the top of my slate when they wheeled me out of the transit bay. Reassigned to Medicae stabilization, not saved, not treated, stabilized. As if I were a crate of munitions with a cracked seal, rather than a man leaking blood through his fatigues. The gurney rattled beneath me, its wheels flattened by centuries of use, each vibration sending bright lances of pain through my ribs and down my spine. I tried to curl inward, but the restraints bit into my wrists and ankles, reminding me that movement was a privilege I no longer possessed. The corridors were too bright. Lumen strips ran in perfect parallel lines along the ceiling, bleaching everything a sickly white that made every stain impossible to ignore. Old blood had soaked into the seams of the floor plates, darkened to brown black where it had been scrubbed and rescrubbed without success. Over it all lay the sharp, choking stink of antiseptic industrial strength, bitter on the tongue, failing utterly to mask the deeper odor of rot and fear. My nostrils flared uselessly. Every breath felt like it scraped me raw from the inside. We passed doors marked with codes instead of names. Wards were numbered, not described. There were no words for hope here, only classifications. I caught glimpses through narrow windows, rows of bodies, some still, some twitching beneath thin sheets, servo arms hanging from the ceiling like steel carrion birds, robed figures bent over slabs, their faces hidden behind augmetic visors that reflected nothing human back at them. Somewhere down the hall, a man screamed until the sound cut off abruptly, as if a switch had been thrown. When we arrived at intake, they did not stop the gurney so much as dock it. A pair of Medicae servitors rolled me into place with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized by a logic I could not follow. One extended a metal probe and pressed it into my neck. Cold flooded my veins, not relief, just paralysis. My muscles locked, my jaw froze half open, and I could no longer even groan. Clerks surrounded me then. Not healers, clerks. They wore stained grey robes and carried data slates and parchment forms, their fingers yellowed with ink and chems. One read aloud my designation in a monotone voice, each syllable flattened of meaning. He did not use my name. That had already been deemed irrelevant. Injury classification: blunt force trauma, shrapnel penetration, thoracic cavity. Pain index severe. Prognosis pending. His quill scratched across parchment as he spoke, the sound sharp and incessant. I found myself focusing on it, the rhythm of bureaucracy drowning out the pounding in my head. Another clerk stamped my forms with a heavy seal, the impact jarring my entire body. A third affixed a small metal tag to my wrist, its edges biting into swollen flesh. I stared at it, reading the code again and again, trying to memorize it, as if knowing what I had been reduced to might somehow protect me. I tried to speak. My throat worked uselessly around the dryness there. The paralysis wore off just enough for a sound to escape, something between a cough and a plea. One of the clerks glanced at me then, briefly, with eyes so tired they barely registered my presence. Pain management will be addressed once intake is complete, he said, already turning away. Supplies are allocated after Tolly. The words landed heavier than any blow. Once supplies are allocated. Not when needed, not when suffering became unbearable. After the counting was done. After permission was granted. After someone decided I was worth the expenditure, they wheeled me onward into the ward proper. The ceiling rose higher here, lost in shadow above the glare of lights. Rows of cots stretched out in brutal symmetry, each occupied by a broken body. Some whispered prayers through cracked lips, others stared blankly upward, eyes glazed with shock or drugs or resignation. A few thrashed weakly against restraints, their movements sluggish, as if underwater. The air hummed constantly with machinery respirators wheezing, auspex units clicking, servo motors whining as they adjusted needles and saws and clamps. I was slid onto a cot near the center aisle. The mattress was thin and smelled faintly of mildew beneath the chemical tang. As they transferred me, my side flared with agony, and this time I could not stop myself from crying out. The sound tore from my chest, raw and animal. No one reacted. A servitor nearby continued cleaning dried blood from the floor, its scrubbing arm moving back and forth with devotional persistence. An orderly approached, human at least, though augmented enough that the distinction felt academic. He checked the tag on my wrist against a slate, nodded once, and adjusted a monitor beside my bed. My heart rate spiked immediately, the machine chiming in a reproachful tone. "Try to remain calm," he said, not unkindly but without warmth. "Agitation increases complications." My voice cracked. "The pain. Please." He paused, fingers hovering over the slate. For a moment, hope flared, small, treacherous. Then he shook his head. "Analgesics are pending requisition confirmation," he recited. "You are log. You will receive them when available." When available. I had heard that phrase before, in the manufactorum when parts ran short, in the ration lines when shipments were delayed. It had never meant soon, it had always meant maybe. He moved on to the next cot, already speaking the same words to another broken voice. I lay there, staring up at the lights, each one hallowed by the tears. I could no longer blink away fast enough. My body shook despite my efforts to still it, every tremor sending fresh waves of pain cascading through me. I tried to remember sermons I had heard, words about endurance and sacrifice, about how suffering was the emperor's currency. They felt distant now, abstract. Pain was immediate, pain was intimate. As minutes stretched into hours, I began to understand the truth that no one had bothered to explain. Relief here was not a given. It was not even an expectation. It was a resource, hoarded and rationed like ammunition or fuel. And like all such things in the Imperium, it was never enough. Lying there amid the groans and whispered prayers, I realized that this place was not designed to make us well. It was designed to process us, efficiently, relentlessly, until we were either fit to be used again or quietly removed from the ledger. My fate, like my painkillers, was subject to inventory, and the tally had only just begun. The day the pain suppressants failed to arrive, it did not feel like an event. There was no alarm, no announcement on the ward vox, no frantic running of boots on metal decking. It was delivered the same way everything was delivered in that place, through routine, through indifferent mouths, through the quiet bureaucracy of deprivation. I watched the world narrow to my cot and the harsh lights above it, and then widen again in brief, brutal flashes whenever an orderly passed close enough for me to smell their oil, stained robes, and the sour sweat trapped beneath rebreathers. I had learned the rhythms of the ward in the hours since intake. The servitors moved on precise cycles. One came to check monitors, another to mop, another to collect waste. The human orderlies were less predictable, dragged by demands and quotas and the endless, grinding need to keep bodies from becoming corpses too quickly. The clerks arrived in clusters, their data, slates clacking, their stamping seals thudding like small, distant executions. Sometimes a robed surgeon glided by in silence, trailing the scent of sterilizer and cold metal, eyes hidden behind lenses that never blinked, and always, threaded through it all, the pain. It did not remain constant, it evolved. At first it was sharp, bright, immediate, like being impaled on heated wire with every breath. Later it became a deeper burn, swelling in my chest, crawling along nerves that felt stripped raw. It was a living thing inside me, turning slowly, testing boundaries, finding new places to sink its teeth. They had told me the suppressants would come once supplies were tallied. So I waited, because waiting was all a man could do when his name was a code and his body belonged to the ward. I waited through the shift, change prayer, when the orderlies paused to face a rusted icon bolted to the far wall and intoned litanies of purity. I waited through the ration carts passing, the smell of thin broth rising like an insult, as it was ladled into the mouths of those who could swallow. I waited through the quiet death of the man 2 cots down, whose breathing simply stopped while his eyes remained open, fixed on nothing. When the Medicae servitor finally came for me, I felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was humiliating. It rolled toward my cot on squealing wheels, its torso a box of stained plating, its head a cluster of lenses and incense vents. Its injector arm extended as it approached, a gleaming metal limb fitted with a needle thick as a quill. I had watched it administer relief to others, an efficient jab into the neck, a hiss of pneumatic pressure, and then the patient's body slackening as if blessed by sudden peace. The servitor halted beside me with a soft click of brakes. A small lumen on its chest plate blinked green. It tilted its head as if regarding me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and sore. "Please," I whispered, because I could not help myself. "Please." The servitor did not respond. It never did. It merely brought its injector arm forward, and I braced for the sting, imagining the cool spread of chemical mercy through my veins. The needle hovered a finger width above my skin, then the arm twitched. There was a faint grinding sound, a mechanical hesitation. The needle withdrew half an inch, then extended again, then stopped entirely. The servitor's chest lumen flickered once, amber, a thin, harsh chirp sounded from inside its torso, an error tone. The servitor's head tilted again, and this time I saw the truth reflected in its lenses. The injector reservoir was empty. There was no fluid sloshing in the transparent chamber, no pressure line primed. The machine had been sent here out of habit, a ritual without substance. My breath caught, and the pain surged in response, as if eager to punish hope. I tried to speak, but it came out as a strangled sound. The servitor made another error chirp, more insistent. Its injector arm retracted fully, hanging limp at its side like a dead limb. The amber light continued to flash. Resupply required. I stared at it, waiting for someone to notice, to correct the mistake. In my mind, this was a problem that could be solved. A machine had run dry. Surely that meant someone would refill it. Surely that meant someone would hurry. But the ward did not shift. The servitors continued their cycles. The orderlies continued their work. The man across the aisle continued to sob into his pillow, each sound wet and broken. The clerks continued stamping forms. No one reacted because, to them, this was not an emergency. It was merely a change in inventory. An orderly approached, drawn by the servitor's error chirp more as an annoyance than an alarm. He glanced at the flashing amber lumen, sighed, and tapped a few commands into the servitor's slate port with the bored precision of someone clearing a clogged drain. "Empty," he said, as if narrating the obvious. My voice scraped out of me. "Refill it." He looked at me then, not with cruelty, but with a tired detachment that felt worse. "No refill. Not today." "What do you mean, not today?" My hands trembled against the restraints. "Look at me. I can't." He cut me off with a gesture, palm down, the universal sign for silence. "Shortage was confirmed this morning. Requisition denied pending audit. Pain suppressants are non-essential allocation in current triage tier." The words hit like a lash. Non-essential. My pain was a category, and in that category it did not matter. Non-essential, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of it. "So what am I supposed to do?" The orderly shrugged, a small motion that carried the weight of the Imperium's indifference. "Endure." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the servitor beside my cot with its useless arm hanging. After a moment, the machine's logic caught up with the new command input. It emitted a softer chirp, acknowledgement, and rolled away, amber light still flashing like a warning no one intended to heed. I lay there, the absence of relief becoming its own kind of torment. It wasn't just that the pain remained, it grew sharper, emboldened by the knowledge that there would be no chemical wall between it and my mind. Every breath dragged fire through my chest. Every shift of my weight sent knives through my ribs. My bandages itched and stung, soaked with old blood and disinfectant. The air felt too thick to inhale, as if the ward itself pressed down on my lungs. Around me, the knowledge spread. It moved like a sickness, whispered from cot to cot, carried on the thin threads of human desperation. At first it was disbelief. "They'll bring more." Someone murmured. "They have to." Another replied, voice cracking. Then anger, thin and frantic. "This is wrong." A man near the far wall rasped, his face swollen, one eye sealed shut. "We fought. We bled. We..." His words dissolved into a scream when a coughing fit seized him and tore at his wounds. Not everyone screamed. Some prayed. The prayers were not gentle. They were desperate, hoarse, spoken through clenched teeth. The ward filled with muttered litanies and sobbing invocations, voices overlapping into a grim chorus. "Emperor, preserve me. Emperor, forgive me. Emperor, let me not break." A woman 2 cots away began chanting steadily, the same line over and over, as if repetition could stitch her mind back together. Her hands were bandaged into stiff shapes, but her lips moved tirelessly. There was a wildness in her eyes, a fever, bright devotion that scared me more than the screams. Because I understood then what the shortage truly meant. Pain suppressants weren't just medicine. They were a barrier between flesh and madness. They were the thin line that allowed a person to remain compliant, to remain human in the face of the ward's constant cruelty. Without them, we were raw nerve endings pinned to cots, our minds forced to chew on agony until something gave. And something always gives. By evening, the ward was louder. People who had been silent began to moan. People who had moaned began to shout. A few began to laugh high, brittle laughs that cut through the air like broken glass. Orderlies moved faster now, their patience fraying. They barked orders, tightened restraints, shoved prayer sheets into trembling hands. Each time someone's voice rose too high, an orderly would lean close and hiss a warning. Control yourself. Don't make yourself a problem. A problem. As if suffering were a breach of protocol. I tried to follow their command. I tried to be still, to breathe shallowly, to keep my mind from focusing on the sensation that had become my entire world. I counted lumen strips. I recited fragments of prayer. I traced the code on my wrist tag with my thumb until the skin blistered beneath the metal. But pain is not something you can reason with. It is not something you can negotiate. It arrives with certainty and demands payment, late in the night cycle. When the lumen strips dim to simulate darkness, I heard the first true breaking. It started as a low whimper from somewhere in the ward, then escalated into a pleading cry. No, 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 please, please, please. The voice rose, shrill and panicked, until it became a scream that scraped at my skull. A few orderlies hurried over, their boots clenching. I couldn't see the source from my cot, but I heard the struggle, the slap of hands on flesh, the metallic snap of restraints being tightened. Hold still. We can't. No suppressants, just hold. Then a different sound, the hiss of a sedative injector. Sharp and final. The screaming cut off mid-breath. Silence followed, heavy and sudden, like a door closing. I lay there in the aftermath, heart racing, sweat slick on my skin. That was their solution when pain became inconvenient. Not relief, but unconsciousness. Not mercy, but control. I turned my head slightly and saw the shrine icon bolted to the wall, an iron figure with a stern, featureless face, surrounded by candles that burned with fueled steadiness. Someone had pinned a strip of parchment beneath it, a quotation in cramped script. Pain is proof of life. Endurance is proof of faith. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. The ward smelled of antiseptic and old blood, but beneath it always the faint iron tang of fresh suffering. I listened to the distant moans, the murmured prayers, the occasional sob that broke loose like steam from a cracked pipe. And in that moment, I understood what they expected of us. They expected us to suffer quietly, to turn agony into devotion, to treat the absence of relief as a moral lesson rather than a logistical failure. Pain, unmedicated, was not considered a crisis. It was considered a test. They did not wait for the pain to subside, because it never would. The schedule was already behind, and delays were a kind of heresy in a place where time was measured in quotas and casualties. When the surgeons came for me, it was with the same detached efficiency as everything else, no urgency, no reassurance, just inevitability. A servitor arrived first, its claws unlocking my restraints and re-fastening them to a narrower gurney. This one stained darker, older. I was lifted, my body protesting with a white, hot flare that stole my breath, and wheeled away from the cot that had already begun to feel like the only fixed point in a dissolving world. The operating theater was colder than the ward. The air bit at my skin, raising gooseflesh even through the grime and bandages. Lumen strips burned brighter here, reflecting off polished steel surfaces that bore the fine scratches of constant use. The smell changed too, less antiseptic, more metal and scorched flesh. A faint ozone tang that prickled at the back of my throat. I knew, with a clarity sharpened by pain, that this was a place where bodies were opened as a matter of routine. They slid me onto the table and locked me in place. Metal clamps closed around my wrists, my ankles, my chest. I tried to shift to find a position that hurt less, but the restraints were merciless, biting into swollen flesh. My heart hammered against my ribs. The monitor beside me chiming in irritation. A robed figure loomed into my field of vision. The surgeon's face was hidden behind a mask studded with lenses and augmetic ports, tubes snaking from it into the machinery overhead. There was no introduction, no explanation of what they intended to do. My chart was projected briefly onto a slate above me, lines of data scrolling past faster than I could read. No suppressants, I croaked, my voice already hoarse from hours of controlled breathing and failed prayers. "Please, I can't." The surgeon tilted their head a fraction, as if acknowledging a minor obstacle. "Pain management unavailable," they said, voice filtered and flat. "Proceeding under standard contingency." Standard contingency. I wondered how many times those words had been spoken in this room. How many people had heard them and understood, too late, what they meant. The first cut was exploratory. A scalpel descended into my field of vision, its edge gleaming. I felt the pressure before the pain, a dull insistence as the blade pressed into skin. Then the sensation exploded outward, a tearing, burning agony that ripped a sound from my throat despite my efforts to hold it back. My back arched reflexively, but the clamps held me fast. The scream echoed off the steel walls, raw and undignified. The surgeon did not react. The blade moved with practiced precision, opening me layer by layer. I felt everything. The slicing of skin, the resistance of muscle, the wet, nauseating warmth as blood flowed freely. The air filled with the smell of iron and something deeper, sweeter, that I recognized with distant horror as my own flesh. "Hold still." An orderly snapped from somewhere near my head. A gloved hand pressed down on my shoulder, not to comfort, but to prevent movement. "You'll make it worse." As if worse were a meaningful distinction now. They worked quickly, because speed was the only mercy left to offer. Servo arms descended, whirring softly as they cauterized bleeding vessels. Each touch of heat sent new shocks through my body, pain blooming and overlapping until it became impossible to distinguish one source from another. My vision tunneled, darkening at the edges. I tasted copper as I bit down hard enough to break skin inside my mouth, desperate to anchor myself to something other than the agony. I tried to focus on details. The hum of machinery, the faint chant playing over the theater's vox, a litany intoned by a disembodied voice praising the sanctity of function. The smell of burning flesh mingled with incense pumped into the air to appease the machine spirits. The words washed over me without meaning, but their rhythm gave me something to cling to. At some point, a saw was introduced. I heard it before I saw it, the high-pitched whine cutting through the other sounds. Panic surged, sharp and immediate. I thrashed against the restraints, every instinct screaming at me to flee. "No," I gasped. "No. Necessary," the surgeon said calmly. "Structural compromise." The saw bit into bone, and the pain transcended description. It was not just sensation, it was revelation. It showed me every nerve, every hidden pathway of my body, lighting them up all at once. My scream tore itself apart, collapsing into a hoarse, broken sound that barely resembled a human voice. Tears streamed down my temples, pooling in my ears. The world narrowed to that single point of violation. I remember thinking absurdly that this was what it meant to be truly awake. No drugged haze, no merciful fog, just the body laid bare to itself. Time lost coherence. Minutes stretched into eternities, then snapped back into moments. I drifted on the edge of consciousness, pulled back again and again by fresh waves of pain whenever I began to slip. The surgeon spoke occasionally, issuing commands to the servitors, noting measurements and adjustments. They discussed my body as if it were a malfunctioning engine, its components to be repaired or replaced as efficiency dictated, damage extensive, viability acceptable. Proceed. At one point my voice was gone entirely. My throat burned, raw and useless. I could still make sounds, wet, animal noises that embarrassed me even as they escaped, but no words. Perhaps that was a mercy. There was nothing left to ask for. When it was over, they did not tell me. There was no announcement, no reassurance. The saw withdrew, the servo arms retracted, the clamps loosened slightly, enough to allow shallow breathing without tearing fresh wounds. My body lay limp on the table, trembling uncontrollably. Every nerve felt flayed, exposed to the cold air. The surgeon leaned over me one last. "Procedure complete," they said, "outcome pending." Then they turned away. Already focused on the next chart, the next body, I was transferred back onto the gurney. The movement sent sparks of pain through me, but compared to what had come before, it was distant, almost abstract. I floated somewhere above my body, watching as they wheeled me back into the ward. The familiar smells and sounds washed over me like a grim parody of homecoming. They returned me to my cot and secured the restraints. The monitor resumed its steady complaint about my vital signs. An orderly adjusted my bandages with brisk efficiency, his touch firm and impersonal. "No complications," he muttered, more to the slate than to me. "You're lucky." Lucky. The word echoed in my hollowed-out mind as he moved on. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my body a map of fresh agony layered atop old. Pain had ceased to be something that demanded attention. It was simply the state of things, like gravity or the constant hum of the ward. I no longer flinched at it. There was nowhere left to retreat. Around me, others were being wheeled in and out, their own procedures conducted with the same ruthless efficiency. I listened to their cries, recognized the stages, the disbelief, the terror, the breaking point. I wondered how many would return. I wondered how many would not, as the simulated night deepened and the ward quieted to a low chorus of moans and labored breathing. I understood that something fundamental had shifted inside me. Pain was no longer an interruption. It was the background against which all other thoughts played out. In the Imperium, emergencies are addressed only if they threaten the system. Individual suffering does not qualify. On that table, under cold lights and in different hands, I learned the truth that would follow me for the rest of my short, measured existence. Pain was not a problem to be solved. It was the price of continued function. After the operation, time ceased to behave properly. It did not move forward so much as it pooled around me, thick and stagnant, broken only by the ward's routines. The lumen, strips dimmed and brightened according to schedules logged somewhere far above my comprehension, but inside my body there was no cycle, only an unbroken continuum of pain, exhaustion, and fevered half-awareness. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, the kind that never refreshes, where every dream bleeds seamlessly back into waking agony. The ward filled faster than it emptied. I noticed it first in the sounds, more coughing, more wet, rattling breaths, more whispered prayers layered atop one another until they became a constant murmur. Gurneys arrived in clusters now, their wheels squealing under the weight of fresh casualties. The orderlies moved with greater urgency but less care, hands rough, voices sharp. There was no room for gentleness when space itself had become a scarce resource. They placed new cots wherever they could, between rows, against walls, sometimes directly beneath the shrine icon where candle wax dripped onto bandages and skin alike. Those who could still sit upright were ordered to do so, freeing their cots for the newly arrived. Those who could not were assessed with brisk efficiency, their charts scanned, their chances weighed. I learned the sound of assessment. It was the pause at the foot of a cot, the low murmur of data being read aloud, the faint click of a slate being updated. Sometimes it ended with a nod and the words, "Continue observation." Sometimes it ended with a shake of the head and a curt command, "Sedate," or worse, "Log and move." The dead did not leave immediately. There were not enough hands for that. They remained among us, cooling slowly beneath sheets, their presence marked by a different smell, less sharp than antiseptic, more sweet and cloying. Servitors came periodically to confirm death, metal probes pressing into unresponsive flesh. When confirmation was achieved, a tag was affixed, and the body was wheeled away to join a queue I never saw. I listened as names, or rather designations, were read out and entered into the ledger. Cause of death was reduced to code as systemic failure, infection, trauma. Acceptable losses, all of them. The words were spoken without emphasis, without pause, as if reciting inventory rather than the end of a human existence. Infection crept into me quietly. It announced itself first as heat, a throbbing warmth beneath my bandages that felt different from the surgical pain. Then came the smell, faint at first, a sour undertone that mingled with antiseptic and made my stomach turn. I tried to alert an orderly when he passed, my voice barely more than a rasp. "My wound." I whispered. "Something's wrong." He glanced at the bandage, peeled back a corner with gloved fingers and frowned. "Inflammation," he said. "Expected." "Please," I said again. "It's burning. I feel wrong." He resecured the bandage and tapped a note into his slate. "Antibiotics pending review. Analgesics unavailable. Monitor, monitor, always monitor." As if observation alone could alter the course of decay. The fever came next. It rolled through me in waves, alternating between chills that left my teeth chattering and sweats that soaked the thin mattress beneath me. My thoughts grew slippery, difficult to hold. Sometimes I thought I heard my name spoken softly, close to my ear, only to realize it was the murmur of prayers from the cot beside me. Other times, the ceiling seemed to pulse, the lumen strips bending and warping, as if the ward itself breathed. Those who thrashed too much drew attention. I watched it happen to a man near the center aisle, his injuries severe but not immediately fatal. He began to shout incoherently, his arms straining against restraints as fever and pain drove him into panic. Orderlies converged on him quickly, their expressions hard. "Hold him still." One barked. I can't." The man sobbed, his voice breaking. They did not argue. A sedative injector hissed and his body went slack mid-cry. He did not wake again. By the next cycle, his cot was occupied by someone else. Others were simply restrained more tightly. Straps were tightened until circulation was a concern, metal cuffs biting into swollen wrists. The message was clear: compliance was mandatory, consciousness optional. I learned to lie still. Even when my muscles spasmed, even when the infection sent sharp, stabbing pains through my chest, I forced myself not to move. I focused on breathing, shallow and controlled. I recited litanies silently, not because I believed they would help, but because they gave my mind something to cling to. I feared sedation almost as much as death. At least awake, I still existed. Requests for analgesics continued, but they had become almost ceremonial. The orderlies recorded them dutifully, their slates filling with red highlighted notes that led nowhere. Somewhere beyond the ward, forms were being filed, audits conducted, supply chains examined. The machinery of the Imperium turned with glacial indifference, grinding hope into dust beneath its gears. Survival, I realized, was not about healing. It was about remaining below notice. The truly desperate drew attention. The quiet sufferers faded into the background, neither urgent enough to save nor disruptive enough to sedate. I aimed for that narrow, miserable middle ground. At night, if it could be called that, when the lights merely dimmed, I listened to the ward breathe. The respirators hissed, the monitors chimed, the occasional sob cut through the darkness like a knife. I could tell when someone died by the subtle change in sound, a breath that did not resume, a monitor that shifted from frantic beeping to a flat, accusing tone. Sometimes an orderly came quickly. Sometimes they did not. One night, an elderly man in the cot beside me reached out with a trembling hand and grasped my sleeve. His eyes were sunken, his skin waxy. "Don't let them forget me," he whispered. I did not know what to say. There was no promise I could make. I squeezed his hand weakly, feeling how cold it already was. "I'm here," I said, though even as I spoke, I knew it was a lie. Presence meant nothing here. Witness meant nothing. By the next cycle, his cot was empty. The ward grew quieter as days blurred together, not because there was less suffering, but because there were fewer voices left to express it. The prayers became softer, more fragmented. The screams rarer, replaced by exhausted whimpers and ragged breathing. Infection claimed those the initial wounds had spared. Fever and neglect did what enemy fire could not. I felt myself slipping too. The infection gnawed at me, my thoughts wandering more often into dark, disjointed places. Sometimes I imagined the pain suppressants arriving at last, a cart wheeled in under armed guard, each injector filled and gleaming. Sometimes I imagined standing up, walking out of the ward, leaving the smell and the screams behind. These fantasies felt dangerous. Hope here was another kind of pain. I began to understand the true cruelty of the place. It was not that people died. Death was expected. It was that death happened slowly, logged meticulously, and accepted as the natural outcome of insufficient resources. The ward was not a failure of the system. It was the system functioning as designed. As I lay there, feverish and trembling, I prayed not for relief, but for invisibility. I prayed that I would not draw attention, that my decline would be gradual enough to avoid intervention, swift enough to avoid prolonged suffering. Survival had become a clerical anomaly, a line item that might be overlooked if I remained unremarkable. In the Imperium, to be forgotten is a fate worse than death. But in that ward, it was the only chance any of us had. He arrived during a lull, when the ward had settled into its low, miserable equilibrium. The screams had tapered off into hoarse murmurs, the machines into their steady, accusing rhythms. I sensed him before I saw him, because the air changed. Incense cut through the antiseptic stench, thick and cloying, catching in my throat and making my eyes sting. Somewhere, a small bell chimed, its sound sharp and ceremonial, wholly out of place amid the groans and coughing. The confessor moved slowly down the central aisle, flanked by two acolytes bearing candles that guttered despite the lack of wind. His robes were heavy, layered, stitched with devotional text and purity seals that brushed against cots as he passed. Each seal bore tiny script, verses, warnings, reminders of duty, that fluttered like accusing tongues. He did not hurry. There was no need. Suffering, after all, was patient. He stopped at each cot in turn, leaning close to murmur prayers, pressing a sign of the aquila onto foreheads slick with sweat. Some reached for him, fingers trembling, eyes wide with desperate hope. Others turned their faces away, jaws clenched, already knowing that whatever he brought would not be relief. When he reached me, I smelled old paper, wax, and something faintly metallic beneath the incense. He peered down at me, his face lined and severe, eyes sharp with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "Child of the Imperium," he intoned, voice practiced and resonant. "You suffer." It was not a question. "Yes," I whispered, the word tearing at my throat. "Please." "The pain, there's nothing. They've run out." He nodded, unsurprised, as if this confirmed something he already knew. One of his acolytes handed him my chart, and he scanned it quickly, lips moving as he read. "You endure much," he said. "This is noted." I swallowed. "Is there? Can you?" I did not know what I was asking for anymore. Medicine, intervention, a word that would carry weight where mine did not. He raised a hand, forestalling me. "Pain is not an enemy," he said gently. "It is a lesson." The words landed like a verdict. He reached into his robes and withdrew a small, stamped seal affixed to a strip of parchment. With careful deliberation, he pressed it onto my chart, smoothing it flat. "Your endurance has been sanctified," he continued. "This seal marks you as one who bears suffering in the Emperor's name." I stared at the seal, at the neat, authoritative script declaring my agony a virtue. "I don't want to be sanctified," I said, the bitterness surprising even me. "I just want it to stop." His gaze hardened just a fraction. "Desire is weakness," he replied. "Duty is strength." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "The flesh cries out for comfort, but the soul is refined through trial. Each moment of pain is an offering. Embrace it, and you will be cleansed." I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to scream. The pain did not lessen. If anything, it sharpened, made crueler by the expectation that I should welcome it. My suffering had been reframed, weaponized against me. To complain now was not just weakness, it was impiety. Around me, I heard similar exchanges. Murmured reassurances that rang hollow, blessings that felt like condemnations. The confessor moved on, leaving behind purity seals and quiet despair in equal measure. After he passed, the ward felt heavier. Not physically, but spiritually, as if the air itself pressed down with the weight of imposed meaning. Those who had begged for relief now whispered prayers instead, their voices tinged with guilt for having asked in the first place. A few smiled through clenched teeth, convincing themselves, or trying to, that their pain was a gift. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the confessor's words echoing in my mind. "Endurance cleanses the soul." If that were true, then this place should have been the purest shrine in the Imperium. Instead, it was a factory of slow death, its products measured in suffering and silence. I felt anger then, hot and dangerous, flaring beneath the fever. Not at the confessor himself, he was merely another functionary, another cog, but at the system that had decided my pain was useful precisely because it cost nothing. Faith was cheaper than medicine. Dogma required no resupply. The seal on my chart ensured that no one would argue on my behalf now. My suffering had been officially justified. To ease it would be to interfere with a sanctioned trial. I turned my head slightly and caught sight of the shrine icon at the end of the ward, candles flickering beneath its impassive gaze. I wondered how many had died beneath it, convinced until their last breath that their agony served some higher purpose. I wondered if the Emperor, if such a being truly watched, could distinguish between devotion freely given and endurance forced by neglect. The pain pulsed, relentless. I breathed through it, because there was nothing else left to do. The confessor had given me the only anesthetic the Imperium still had to offer. Faith, and it burned worse than any wound. Mercy did not vanish entirely after the confessor left. It simply went underground. I discovered this slowly, in fragments, the way one learns forbidden things in the Imperium, not through instruction, but through observation and risk. The ward was too crowded, too strained, for rules to be enforced perfectly. Supplies were short, personnel shorter, and exhaustion gnawed at even the most disciplined. In those cracks, small, treasonous kindnesses took root. It began with an orderly I had not noticed before. He was younger than most, his augmetics minimal, his eyes still capable of something like hesitation. During a routine bandage check, he lingered by my cot longer than protocol allowed. His hands paused as he adjusted the wrappings around my chest, fingers pressing just a little more firmly than necessary. The pressure sent a sharp jolt through me, and I hissed despite myself. "Quiet," he murmured, not unkindly. "I know." He pressed again, deliberately this time, holding steady until the pain shifted. It did not disappear, but it dulled, the sharp edge blunted by a spreading numbness where nerves were overwhelmed by force. I stared at him, realization dawning. He did not meet my eyes. "Don't react," he whispered. "If they see," I nodded as best I could, every muscle rigid with effort. He finished the adjustment quickly and moved on, but the relief lingered, a small pocket of reduced sensation in a body otherwise aflame. It felt illicit. Precious. I clung to it like contraband. After that, I noticed others doing similar things. Alcohol wipes pressed too long against the skin, the cold burning almost as fiercely as the wounds, but leaving behind a blessed dullness. Bandages wrapped tighter than recommended, cutting circulation just enough to deaden feeling. An orderly repositioning a limb and holding it there, counting under their breath until the shaking subsided. These acts were never acknowledged. No words passed between giver and receiver beyond a glance, a subtle nod. To thank them openly would be to endanger them. Mercy here had to be deniable. Not everyone received it. There were too many of us, and the risks were real. I saw what happened when one act of kindness went too far. An orderly was caught slipping a patient a vial he had siphoned from a locked cabinet, some mild sedative, barely enough to take the edge off. A clerk noticed the discrepancy during an audit. They did not shout. They did not make a scene. 2 enforcers arrived quietly and took the orderly away. His cot rounds were reassigned before the cycle ended. No explanation was given. The cabinet was sealed with additional purity locks. The message was clear. Compassion was a breach of protocol. As supplies dwindled further, the ward changed again. The orderlies grew harder, not from cruelty but from necessity. There was no time to linger, no room for small mercies when the flow of bodies increased and the tools to treat them decreased. The surgeons adapted their methods accordingly. Amputations became common. At first they were justified. Gangrene, structural damage, infection beyond control. But as the days wore on, the criteria shifted. Limbs were removed not because they could not be saved, but because saving them took time and resources the ward no longer had. I watched it happen to the woman who had chanted prayers endlessly during the shortage. An infection had taken hold in her leg, creeping upward despite antibiotics that arrived too late and in too small a dose. The surgeon reviewed her chart, lips pursed behind the mask. Amputation reduces resource drain, they said, as if reading from a manual. Proceed. She screamed when they told her, begged them to try again, to wait. There were no pain suppressants for the procedure. There never were. They restrained her and worked quickly, the saw's whine slicing through the ward's constant hum. Her screams echoed, raw and unfiltered, until her voice broke and dissolved into hoarse sobs. When it was over, she lay pale and shaking, one leg gone, the stump wrapped in thick bandages already darkening with blood. She stared at the ceiling, eyes empty, prayers forgotten. Efficiency had been achieved. I began to understand the calculus at work. A man with one arm required fewer dressings, fewer antibiotics, fewer minutes of attention than a man with a festering limb. A body simplified was easier to manage. Humanity was an inefficiency the ward could no longer afford. The screams became a constant companion. Each one cut through me, not just with sympathy but with fear. Every cry was a reminder that I, too, could be deemed simpler if something about me crossed an invisible threshold. Infection spread. Fever climbed. At any moment, a surgeon might decide that removing part of me was the most economical solution. I guarded my wounds obsessively, reporting nothing unless forced. I endured swelling, heat, the slow creep of rot, because I feared intervention more than decay. I pressed my bandages tight when I could, seeking numbness even at the cost of circulation. I accepted every small, forbidden kindness with silent gratitude, knowing it might be the last. One night the young orderly returned. He checked my chart, frowning slightly at the seal the confessor had placed there. "They've marked you," he said quietly. "I know," I whispered. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a cloth, damp and sharp-smelling. Alcohol. He pressed it against my neck, holding it there until my skin burned and then went strangely distant. "Don't let them see," he said again. "Thank you." I breathed, the words barely audible. He shook his head. "Don't thank me. If they notice, it won't matter." He was right. Gratitude was a liability. Attachment was dangerous. The ward devoured both without distinction. As he moved on, I noticed how tired he looked. His hands trembled slightly. His eyes darted constantly, watching for clerks, for enforcers, for anyone who might question his actions. Mercy was taking its toll on him too. By the next cycle he was gone. Reassigned perhaps, or punished, or simply broken enough to be removed from duty. No one said. His absence was just another gap in the ward's routine, quickly filled by someone harder, faster, less inclined to risk anything. The amputations continued. The orderlies stopped explaining them. They became just another procedure, another way to manage the overflow. I listened to the saws and tried not to imagine their path turning toward me. Each scream reinforced the truth I had been circling since intake. This place did not exist to save lives. It existed to preserve function at the lowest possible cost. Anything that interfered with that goal, pain, protest, even compassion, was trimmed away. Efficiency outweighed humanity. I lay there, body diminished, soul ground down by constant calculation, and wondered how much of me could be removed before I was no longer worth maintaining at all. The ward had taught me to think this way, to measure myself in terms of burden and output, and in doing so, it had already taken more from me than any saw ever could. They did not come with surgeons this time. No gurney arrived at my cot, no servitors unlocked my restraints. There was no whine of saws, no smell of cauterized flesh. In some ways, that made it worse. What came for me instead was a desk. It arrived in pieces. First, a rolling lectern, its surface scarred by ink spills and knife marks. A clerk with a slate clasped to his chest, another with parchment scrolls tucked under one arm. They positioned themselves at the foot of my cot as if assembling an altar. Last came the administrator, robed in layered grey and black, his augmetic eye clicking softly as it focused on me. I knew what this was the moment I saw him. The ward had whispered of these visits in low, fearful tones. Not healing rounds, not spiritual counsel, assessment, reclassification. The administrator did not look at me at first. He reviewed my chart, scrolling through data with a detached efficiency that made my stomach clench. I saw the purity seal from the confessor, the red annotations marking delayed treatments, the infection flags that had gone unresolved. Each note was a nail in a coffin I could not see. Designation confirmed, he said at last. His voice was calm, measured, practiced. Duration in Medicae extended. Resource expenditure above median. Functional recovery improbable. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry, my tongue thick. I began, then faltered. I did not even know what I was trying to argue. That I could work, that I could fight, that I deserved to live. He raised a hand, silencing me without looking up. "Please conserve energy," he said mildly. "This will be brief." Brief. I had learned to fear that word. He turned the slate so that one of the clerks could see it, and they murmured together, exchanging numbers and codes. Survival odds were discussed like weather patterns, fluctuating and impersonal. Pain did not enter into it. Suffering was not a metric. Current status recovering, the administrator said. Proposed status expendable. The word settled over me like ash. Expendable. I had heard it before, applied to ammunition, to equipment, to entire regiments. I had never imagined hearing it applied to myself while I still breathed. What does that mean? I asked, though some part of me already knew. It means, he replied, finally meeting my gaze. That continued investment is no longer justified. You will remain under observation, but active intervention will be minimized. Pain management allocations will be discontinued entirely. Discontinued entirely. As if they had not already been a fiction. I'll die, I said. The statement was flat, not dramatic. An observation, yes, he agreed. Eventually. There was no malice in his tone, no satisfaction, just certainty. One of the clerks stepped forward and updated my wrist tag, snapping a new plate over the old one. The code changed. I felt the click of it like a lock engaging. Expendable status noted. The clerk intoned. I laughed then. It surprised me as much as anyone. The sound that came out of my throat was weak, cracked, but unmistakably laughter. It bubbled up from somewhere deep, born of exhaustion and a bitter clarity I could no longer suppress. So that's it, I said. No more forms. No more waiting. I just run out. The administrator watched me with something like curiosity. You misunderstand, he said. You have already run out. This merely acknowledges the fact. He gestured, and the clerks packed up their things with efficient motions. The lectern was rolled away. The administrator turned to leave, his business concluded. Wait, I said, panic flaring despite myself. Please, I can still endure. I've endured all of it. I haven't complained. I haven't. He paused at the end of the cot, his back to me. Endurance is noted, he said. It does not alter the outcome. Then he was gone. The ward did not change immediately. The machines continued their steady hum. The orderlies continued their rounds. But something fundamental had shifted. I felt it in the way they looked at my chart now, briefly, without concern. In the way they adjusted my bandages quickly, without checking for signs of infection. In the way they no longer recorded my requests, because there was no point. I had crossed an invisible line. On one side, you were a problem to be solved. On the other, a process to be allowed to complete itself. The young orderly, the last one who had shown me small kindnesses, did not come back. The others did not press alcohol to my skin or apply pressure to numb my nerves. Why risk punishment on someone already written off? Painkillers were no longer even a theoretical possibility. They were not delayed or pending. They were simply not for me. The pain responded to this revelation as if it had been waiting. It surged, bold and unrestrained, no longer checked by hope or expectation. Every breath was a labor. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer striking cracked bone. The infection burned hotter now, unchecked, spreading with deliberate patience. I watched as others were assessed in the days that followed. Some were reclassified upward, fit for labor details, servitor conversion, returned to the front. They were wheeled away, their suffering given a purpose. Others were marked as I had been, their charts stamped with finality. We began to recognize each other, those of us beyond saving. There was a look we shared, a quiet understanding. We were the ward's remainder, the ones who would not be processed further. The forgotten, now officially acknowledged as such. I found a strange calm in it. The waiting was over. The audits, the prayers, the whispered bargains with fate, all of it fell away. There was nothing left to argue, no one left to appeal to. The Imperium does not kill you when you are no longer useful. It simply stops preventing your death. I lay there, watching the ceiling, counting the flickers in the lumen strips as my vision blurred. My thoughts grew slower, heavier, dragged down by fever and fatigue. But there was clarity too, sharp and unforgiving. I had given everything I was asked to give. My body, my endurance, my faith even when it was hollow. And in the end, the ledger had decided I was a poor investment. As the ward moved on around me, already focused on fresher casualties and more promising recoveries, I felt myself slipping further into the margins. I was no longer a patient, I was an inevitability. When the end came, it did not announce itself. There was no sudden collapse, no dramatic moment where everything went black. Instead, there was lucidity, cruel, sustained lucidity, like a final audit conducted on my consciousness before it was shut down. My body failed in increments, each one noted by my mind with an awful precision that pain had hummed rather than dulled. I could feel every heartbeat, not as a simple thump, but as a complex event. The squeeze of damaged muscle, the resistance of clogged vessels, the tremor that followed as blood forced its way through passages no longer meant to carry it. Each beat sent a wave of pain outward from my chest, radiating through ribs that no longer aligned correctly, down my spine, into limbs that felt distant and heavy. I counted them without meaning to, each one a reminder that the system was still running, despite everything. Breathing was worse. My lungs burned with every shallow inhale, the air scraping against rawness inside me. I could no longer draw a full breath, my body refused the effort. Instead, I sipped at the air in short, desperate pulls, each one accompanied by a wet, rattling sound I recognized from others who had not lasted long after it began. The ward's machines seemed to listen, their monitors chiming in quiet disapproval as my vitals drifted further from acceptable parameters. No one came. Orderlies passed my cot without stopping, their eyes flicking briefly to my chart before moving on. I was no longer worth the pause. The confessor did not return. There were no more prayers for me, no more seals to justify what was happening. Faith had done its work, and now it had moved on. The pain was everywhere now, no longer localized to wounds or infection. It was systemic, a full-body awareness of decay. My skin felt too tight, stretched over a frame that no longer supported itself properly. My mouth was dry beyond thirst, my tongue thick and uncooperative. I tried to swallow and failed, a weak cough tearing at my chest and leaving me gasping. And through it all, my mind remained clear. That was the true horror of it, I think. Not that I died in pain, but that I understood every part of it. I knew why no one intervened. I knew how my chart read now. I could picture the codes beside my designation, the neat boxes ticked, the final outcome already recorded in some ledger far removed from this ward. I was no longer a patient. I was a process nearing completion. I watched the ward continue without me. A gurney rattled past carrying a fresh casualty, blood still wet, eyes wide with shock and hope. I wondered how long it would take before that hope was stripped away, replaced by the same understanding that now filled me. Somewhere down the aisle, a surgeon argued quietly with a clerk about allocation priorities. Their voices were low, professional, entirely unconcerned with the human cost of their decisions. I tried to move my hand and found that I could not. Not from restraint this time, but from weakness. The effort sent sparks through my arm, then nothing. My fingers lay where they were, pale and still. I felt oddly detached from them, as if they belonged to someone else. A memory surfaced then, unbidden. Not of battle or injury, but of something small and distant standing in a ration line years ago, complaining about the weight, about the thinness of the soup. The memory felt absurd now, almost obscene. I had not understood scarcity then. I had not understood what it meant to be truly unnecessary. My vision began to narrow, the edges darkening despite the harsh lights overhead. I focused on the shrine icon at the end of the ward, its iron face unchanged, its candles burning steadily. Wax had pooled thickly at its base, layers upon layers from countless cycles. I wondered how many had died looking at it, hoping for something, anything to intervene. Did it matter if the Emperor watched? Did it matter if he cared? In the end, the outcome would have been the same. The Imperium did not require my belief any more than it required my survival. The pain peaked, then transformed. It became distant, muffled, as if I was submerged in thick liquid. My heartbeat grew erratic, skipping, stumbling. Each breath was an effort I could no longer reliably summon. Panic flared briefly, instinctive and sharp, then faded under the weight of exhaustion. I felt a strange gratitude then, not for relief, because there was none, but for the clarity. I was awake. I was present. Nothing was hidden from me. The system had not lied, it had simply never pretended to care. A monitor near my head began to emit a slow, steady tone, different from the frantic alarms I had heard before. It was a warning, but not an urgent one. Someone would notice eventually. Someone would log the time. My thoughts grew heavy, each one taking more effort than the last. I tried to form a prayer and failed. There were no words left that felt honest. Instead, I let my mind rest on a simple truth, one that cut through the dogma and the suffering alike. This was not a mistake. The absence of mercy was not a failure of planning or supply. It was not an oversight corrected too late. It was the system working exactly as intended, conserving resources, maximizing output, trimming away what could no longer serve. I exhaled a long, shuddering breath that did not fully draw back in. The pain flared one last time, sharp and bright, then began to recede, not because it was treated, but because there was no longer anything left for it to act upon. As my vision dimmed completely, I understood my place at last. I was not a tragedy, I was not a martyr. I was an acceptable loss, recorded, justified, and forgotten. And in that understanding, there was a bleak, final peace.